Hi, I'm Matt Williams. Welcome to Glimpses. My guest today is a renowned dancer, choreographer, and the artistic director of the Dance Theatre of Harlem. He has choreographed for the New York City Ballet, the San Francisco Ballet, the Royal Ballet, and the Oakland Ballet. I wanted this man on Glimpses for a long time. I didn't know him at all. So I reached out to some friends. I knew his reputation, so I reached out to some friends to make an introduction, and I more or less cold called Robert Garland and asked him to be on Glimpses, and he graciously agreed. So Robert Garland, welcome to Glimpses.
Great to be here. Great to be here, Matt. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you've got a reputation. People love you. I mean, everyone I talk to, they go, "Oh, this guy's phenomenal." So this is a treat for me.
I paid them all.
Okay, good. I hope it was good money.
Yeah.
I want to start, before we get into Dance Theatre of Harlem and the history and the mission, I want to start with you. I was curious, how old were you when you first started moving to music? When did you start moving? When did you discover dance?
You know, my mother was a big music woman. You know, I grew up in the 70s in Philadelphia.
Right.
And so that time period also was a very important time period for Black music in general, post-civil rights.
Right.
Lots of questions being asked by lots of different artists. But my mother was the main catalyst in giving me the musical side of things. And my father was a very physical person. He was a basketball player. You know, he just did a lot of physical things. So I think the combination of the two is how I ended up where I ended up.
Okay, so he's the athlete, she's the musician, and the love of music and that. And
Yes.
you grew up in Philadelphia, and at 15 years of age, you joined the Philadelphia Dance Company as the youngest member.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was a remarkable experience. I'd been studying at Pennsylvania Ballet,
Right.
but my mom took me to classes at a predominantly Black school that had classes for older or adults. So I started actually training with adults.
You did.
Now, adults at that moment for me at 15 was like 20 and 21, you know,
Yes.
and they were mostly college students. But from there, I met a lot of people, and the Philadelphia Dance Company I auditioned for and eventually danced with them as its youngest member. You know, it was in its fledgling years as a dance company there.
Were you intimidated, or were you just inspired? Did you just absorb and watch, or did you go, "What am I doing here at 15?"
Yeah, you know, I just absorbed everything that went on around me. I was a big classical music guy in high school.
Okay.
And so what attracted me as well were the classics, you know, and then I found out that, oh, there's a lot of ballets that are done to classical music. And so I also transferred from an all-boys academic high school, which was, you know, didn't make my mom really happy, and moved to a performing arts high school as well.
Okay. And from there, when you graduated, you went to Juilliard, and you got your BFA at Juilliard.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And if my research is correct, right after Juilliard, you joined the Dance Theatre of Harlem
That's right.
under
That's right.
the direction of Arthur Mitchell. So he saw something in you that I don't know if other people saw, because he made you a principal dancer, and you were featured quite a bit.
Yes.
And on
yes.
top of that, you were the very first resident choreographer.
Yes. Yes.
What did he see in you that made him have such faith in you? I mean, he really seemed to support you and encourage you.
You know, when I was at Juilliard, I actually lived with a dancer that was with the Ailey Company. His name was Gary DeLoach.
Okay.
And the agreement was he would go on the road, I would water the plants and took care of the apartment. And he gave me I lived for almost nothing there my years at Juilliard, which was a big deal because they didn't have dorms at that time. And so Gary allowed me to live there. The time came for me to choose where I was going to dance. And the options as a Black dancer were always very much Alvin Ailey or Dance Theatre of Harlem.
Got it.
And I eventually chose Dance Theatre of Harlem. And so Arthur Mitchell, when I saw him, he knew Alvin,
Right.
and he also knew that I lived with one of Alvin's dancers. And he was like, Robert, what made you decide to dance with Dance Theatre of Harlem? I said, the library. They had a remarkable library, Dance Theatre of Harlem. The books there were phenomenal. And so not only did he have me start as an apprentice with the company, but he also put me in the library with a now very famous, unfortunately he passed away, but he was a leader in the dance librarian archives kind of history. And it was a beautiful experience because I just sat and watched videotapes all day, and got to know the history of Dance Theatre of Harlem and
See,
so much other
that to
things.
me is, I would never think, oh, you go to a dance company, I imagine mirrors and bars. I never think, oh, I get to sit in a library and learn about dancing. That's
Yes,
fascinating.
yes. Well, at the time, they had something called the Professional Training Program, which we're looking to bring back. And it was basically an apprenticeship kind of program where you kind of, after your main training, could also kind of hone your wares or
Okay.
hone your skills, I'm sorry, before entering into the company.
Right.
And so that library is for that purpose. There were courses attached to that program. Yeah.
And how I know people watch movies and see dancers working, and you hear about legendary dancers, how many hours they spent. Give us a sense of how many hours a day you were actually in the room dancing or going through, your moves and just practicing. I mean, it's ongoing.
It is ongoing. It starts. It's a typical day though. It starts around 10 o'clock with your daily class, your ballet
Right.
class, and then you go into your rehearsal period. And then for most organizations, not all, but they hit that mark where the training for the little ones starts at 5 o'clock. And so a big break happens then. And then when that training is over around 6 to 8, in my day, we would go back into the studio and rehearse from 6 to 8. At that moment was a kind of golden moment for me because I was a hard worker and it also was a very interesting moment that happened to me at the time. If I can talk about that.
Absolutely.
We had been asked to go to Russia, to tour Russia, and the request was for Americana. And they knew that we were performing Jerome Robbins' Fancy Free. Jerome Robbins' Fancy Free is based on the town, about the three sailors on leave in New York City, blah, blah, blah. And so I would stay from 6 to 8 because there was only one cast at the time. And everyone's like, why are you staying? Why are you here? He's never going to have another cast. And I did that for like a year and a half. So we were going to go to Russia, and a dancer dropped out. And Arthur Mitchell said, in a room of 50 people, who knows this role? And so I raised my hand, and he was like, young man, you don't even know how to do a passe yet, And I was like, oh, God, So after that, he called me into his office, and he said, Mr. Robbins wants to see you rehearse down at Lincoln Center tomorrow at 9:30. And so I was like, oh, my God. And so I went down to my alma mater, Juilliard.
Right.
It was like they had an 8:30 class. I was like, could you please let me take class? Because I have to go and do Fancy Free for Jerome Robbins. And so I took the class, went over to the State Theater, which is what it was called at the time, now the Coke Theater. Went upstairs. There was a pianist in the room. There was a table and chairs and a bar because that was where Fancy Free happened. And then walks Jerome Robbins and his dog. He was walking his dog. It was like 9:30 in the morning. And so he comes in, he's like, oh, okay. He's like, let's start. And so I sit down and I perform the entire ballet by myself for him. It's a cast of about 6, but I had no other dancers. I did all the mime, all the technique, all the variations, and was exhausted after like about half an hour or 40 minutes, but did the whole ballet. And he came up to me and he looked up and was like, I think you're going to be okay. And then he just like walked out. So that's my Jerome Robbins story, which was a very big deal for me. So yes, I did go to Russia, and yes, I got to perform Fancy Free.
But see, this is a good example. I tell my students, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. That's luck, right? And you
Yes.
prepared, you watched all those nights sitting and watching, all that time spent.
Yes.
And so when the opportunity came along, you were prepared.
I was prepared.
Yeah.
Totally prepared. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
You're
no.
absolutely right.
No, that's
Yeah,
great.
from that period again, there would be a technique class for the kids in the school from 5 to 6:30, and then 6:30 to 8 would be these other rehearsals that no one wanted to stay for,
Yeah.
and I always stayed. And so,
But you talked about technique, and I had a friend who lived on the Upper West Side, and it wasn't far from where Miles Davis lived for a while. And he
yes,
said Miles Davis would go outside on his fire escape and run his scales at night. He says
yes,
every night he would do this, and you go, here's this genius, and he's still running his scales. But that technique and honing and constantly being prepared.
oh yeah, yeah. I told my dancers the other day that John Coltrane slept with his saxophone. Like he slept with it was a part of him,
Right.
And for in our world, for the female dancers, it's the point shoe. The point shoe has to become a part of your body. Now I didn't advocate that they sleep with their point shoes, but the idea that this thing was deeply personal to you was an important point.
Dancers push themselves and push almost to the limit. Are dancers masochistic in some way or another? Or is that just a passion that must be fulfilled? Because, you see, at least in movies, you see where they take the point shoes off and there's blood in the shoe and
Oh yes,
all that drama.
all that
But
drama.
I mean, what is it that drives a person to push their body to the limit over? And I guess it's like a marathon runner or a professional athlete. You just push yourself to the limit.
Yeah, at rock bottom, it's an art form of balance, ballet particularly.
Right.
You train the body each side, you train the body on the right side and then the left side. And I think that it really is, to me, very much akin to yoga or any other meditative practice, physical meditative practice that one may do. And so it actually is a less, it is physically demanding
Right.
when it's put into its choreography, but the training itself is extremely spiritual and deep and meditative.
I never heard anyone ever talk about dance being, like meditation or yoga. But I was going to ask you, is there a spiritual aspect to dance for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I feel that Martha Graham called dancers athletes of God.
Ooh, I love that.
And
The
part of
athletes of God.
athletes of God.
Love it.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's and that's why dance movies tend to do okay, but do not completely capture the essence of what it is to be in this space where you are completely in sort of competition with yourself.
Yes.
It's a non-competitive environment, and therefore it is about what you can accomplish in that moment. And so that part of it enables a deeper kind of reflective side to your participation and how you're making the art happen. If I may say so.
Well, I was looking up quotes and preparing for this, and Martha Graham said, "Great dancers are not great because of their technique; they are great because of their passion." And
Yes.
do you ever feel that you're channeling when you're dancing? Do you ever feel that sense of, and in so many wisdom traditions, dance is a form of connecting with the source.
Precisely,
Right?
precisely. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. In particular, and in the African American tradition as well. I think that the connection between the spiritual and the physical, meaning the dancing itself, has always been a part of the African and African American tradition. So it is actually quite normal to me to be this way. A lot of our dancers on the African American side of things come to dance via little performances that they probably did as children for their parents
Right.
or their relatives. Oh Bobby, come and do that new dance. And so that becomes kind of a communal, beautiful understanding of just how it all comes together in terms of how people relate to one another. It is a communal art form. I used to marvel at Juilliard about how, for an orchestra, like they would practice separately. And so there are tons of music rehearsal halls at Juilliard, little tiny rooms with pianos. And whether you're a violinist, viola, they would all go separately. But every day, dancers are together. There's always a communal aspect. In fact, training by yourself is almost, it's a challenge. Yeah, yeah.
That's now. Let me ask you this: when you go to choreograph something, how do you begin? It's like a writer. I may have an image, or I hear a snippet of dialogue, or I've got an idea I want to, and I'll start writing to understand what's stirring in me. When you go to choreograph a new piece, is there do you have a process, or does it just begin and you just give yourself over to it? How does that evolve?
Oftentimes for me, and I learned this over time, because there comes a moment where you do the art because you like it feels good to you, and then you begin to understand the service of the art form. Now, Arthur Mitchell always said, our founder, you are in service to the art form. And so part of that service for me has been preparing for the dancers that are right in front of me as people, as generationally. And so it's been very important for me to connect the dots for them culturally, particularly in my space. So for instance, my first hit was a ballet called Return to the music of James Brown and Aretha Franklin. And so when I created that work, it was wonderful seeing the dancers hear and discover these artists outside of them selling hamburgers or or sheets, but as real musical artists. And so it gives me great joy that the director of the Juilliard Dance Division now is a DTH alum who performed in my ballet Return.
Really?
Yes. And
Oh,
so
that's great.
it is really Alicia Graff, and she's there now as director of the dance division. So it gives me great joy that yes, she can direct the dance division, but she also understands Aretha Franklin.
So you're going to, that's, well, believe me, everybody's got to learn to appreciate Aretha Franklin.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right.
But you go to choreograph something. Do you do that in front of a mirror? Or if you're by yourself, do you just start moving and see where the movement takes you? Or do you have steps in mind? I'm totally ignorant about this, so it's a whole new world to me.
Sometimes I will go into a studio and create phrases that are of a certain length.
Right.
And maybe two or three. And then once you get into the studio, you see what the dancers do with them, and they begin to make their own painting.
Right.
And so when they make their own painting, you're like, oh, I didn't understand that light was going to hit that way, or whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, I do create some material ahead of time, but also leaving a huge gap for the creativity of the artists that I'm working with.
I think that is vital because I know playwrights who I started as a playwright before I went into TV and film, and they flinch if you don't say "and I went to town" or whatever. And the joy of working with actors, and it sounds like it's the same with dancers, is you have a notion of what the lines are going to be and sound like and how the scenes go. But then the actors bring a whole nother level and go, had no idea that was going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's where you're being flexible. And it sounds like that with dancers. You go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that was part of this. And then you start riffing with them and you start building something.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is truly the joy of creating.
That's the joy of creating for me. Yeah. And so it becomes, again, a thing of service for both myself and for the artist, that we're both in dialogue with this higher power that is going to give us this message about humanity.
Being in service, I try and pound this into the students I teach. I always ask them, what do you want your play or your movie to do? How are you serving? And it's not preaching. It's not, I've got my message, I've got to get to the audience. It's how are you serving the audience? What are you awakening in those audience members?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, the interesting thing about dance is the nonverbal communication part of it. And so oftentimes I find that dancers will absorb what is happening in the world. and weirdly put it out there in their work for good and ill, and so sometimes when we're in very dark times, there's a lot of very dark creation, lots of very dark approaches, and then other times that'll change as well. And so being aware of that too, because do have to be sensitive to the youth that I work with, because they are still young people,
Yeah.
and trying to have them grapple with reality while remaining hopeful.
But everything they experience and see, from a news program to music on the street, is informing them. And and
Absolutely.
especially since they're absorbing it into their body, it's going to be expressed some way, right?
Absolutely. Yes. It's so interesting. I did a ballet to Stevie Wonder's music called Higher Ground. It is the largest amount of music that he's ever allowed anyone to create a work to. So I really thank him for that. And I used music from the 70s where the Motown folk were turning on Berry Gordy basically and saying, our world out there is doing something and we have to begin to reflect that.
Right.
And so Stevie Wonder began to write this music. And so it was very interesting. I did the ballet, and so there was an election that happened, and so who was at the inauguration? Stevie Wonder. Who played for Senator Warnock's whatever it was? Stevie Wonder. And then most recently, he has something to say about what's happening overseas now.
Right.
And so it's good for them to understand that there were artists, and still are the same ones, that spoke up about the current ideas of the day.
Yes.
So that, which is new for them. So there's still. I looked at Stevie Wonder, and now they're seeing Stevie Wonder do the same thing.
Incredible. Incredible. I want to talk a little bit about George Balanchine, because it seems like he had a major influence on Arthur as
Yes.
well as you.
Yes.
And neoclassical ballet. Could you explain to listeners what is neoclassical ballet?
Okay, well, I've read every single Balanchine biography that
Okay.
has been written, which actually is not that much, actually, to be perfectly honest. But Mr. Balanchine was in Paris, and he was invited by a man named Lincoln Kirsten to come, or Lincoln Kirsten went to Paris to invite him. And initially, Balanchine said no. And so that evening, he went out to a club in Paris, and there was a music playing. He went to the owner, said, "What is this music?" The owner says, "It's jazz." He's like, "Oh, well, what country? Where's that from?" He said, "Oh, it's from United States of America." It's like, "Oh, that's where that gentleman's from." So he goes back to Lincoln Kirsten and says, "I'll come back and I'll, maybe go for a couple months." And so he takes a boat. He gets here. He's like, "Where's the jazz?" And people are like, "Well, you have to go uptown." It's like, "Why do I have to go uptown?" He said, "Well, that's where the people are that play it." Because he'd only seen white Parisians play it up until that point.
Wow. Okay.
So he goes uptown. He sits in the clubs that existed, the Renaissance Ballroom, the Savoy, and he watches the syncopation. He sees the speed and everything that's going on, the energy, the American energy. And he's like, "I can do something with this," because at the time, there was already an American Ballet Theater. So he knew he couldn't do Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, all that classical repertoire that he had.
Right.
He could not do it. And so he had to create something new. So he took the syncopation and the speed of the jazz environment that he saw and combined it with ballet and called it neoclassicism. So that's how it started. And it went for a little while, but then he met Arthur Mitchell, which was kind of like a weird time bomb from God, and he put the two of them together. And so he literally would ask Mr. Mitchell, "Arthur, what's this step that happens here? And how does that go? What does that do?" Taking from old jazz dances and dances that were done again in these other spaces.
Right.
And so that was, I think, a wonderful contribution that Arthur Mitchell and then subsequently generations after him took upon themselves.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It
but
is.
the synergy of these two men coming together,
Mm-hmm.
and individually they would create, but together that it was explosive.
Exactly. And and actually he had been in Paris at a time when Josephine Baker was very popular.
course, yes.
And so he also had seen some of that. So I think that the curiosity had already been lit a little bit by by that idea. But George Balanchine choreographed, I think, 5 or 6 all black Broadway shows, and so he was very much in tune with the black community. The Where Dance Theatre of Harlem is right now was originally a Russian community.
Okay.
Yeah, and
I
so
didn't know that.
yeah, so Mr. Balanchine's first church, which is still there, is in Harlem at 153rd in Amsterdam, a Russian Orthodox church. So when he died, everyone's like, "Why are we going to Harlem?" It's like, well, that's where the Russians lived at the time.
Well, let's talk about the Dance Theatre of Harlem. It was formed in 1969,
Yes.
shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I pulled this quote off the web. It said, "In moments of extreme injustice and frustration, the most impactful art is born." And it seemed like that happened with Dance Theatre of Harlem. But
Yes.
tell the listeners a little bit about the history, the purpose, and then we can get into what all you're doing today.
Okay.
Okay?
Well, Dance Theatre of Harlem was founded in 1969 by a man named Arthur Mitchell, who was the first black male principal dancer of a major ballet company, New York City Ballet, who we've already talked about with its founder, George Balanchine. He had a long career there. And for the last 2 years of his career at New York City Ballet, he'd been traveling to Brazil, setting up a school and a company there. And it was his plan to, after his career, to go down to Brazil and start his own school and his own company. You know, it's very interesting. Hollywood actually was after Arthur Mitchell for a very long time because they felt that he would be a good kind of foil to Sidney Poitier because they were both so handsome and so talented. But he did one Hollywood movie with Candice Bergen, and it wasn't really his thing.
He didn't like it,
He didn't like it, and so he decided to start building this thing in Brazil. So he was on his way to. He always said, Robert, it was called Idlewild then, not JFK.
Idlewild, yes.
The airport was
Yes,
Idlewild.
Idlewild.
You know, and he heard about the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he called his friend Cicely Tyson and Mr. Balanchine and Lincoln Kirsten as well and said, you know, I think I'm going to stay and do something in Harlem for the people that raised me. And so he turned around, made a lot of people really angry. And here we are 55 years later. You know, it was a inspired stroke of responsibility, I think, on his part.
In service.
You know, in service.
He's in service again. That's that word.
You know, it's so funny. There are so many catchwords now that we use that I think Arthur Mitchell already was connected to, like social justice, for instance. Like that, this was a social justice moment. It was a moment where he was like, and people thought he was crazy. They were like, you know what, ballet in Harlem, we just lost Dr. King, John F. Kennedy, like, are you crazy? And he was like, no, I think the arts can transform people and make them better individuals. And he believed that deeply. You know, he wanted to have a great ballet company, which he did and still does to this day, but it was more the idea that what the arts can do for an individual or a human being or a young person.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
So,
you know, obviously you have got the company that tours nationally and internationally. You've got the Dance Theatre of Harlem School.
yes.
I didn't realize dancers as young as 3 to 18 are in this school.
3 to 18, yeah. You know, Dance Theatre of Harlem, we've always been very humble about the things that we pioneered, but we were actually the pioneers of taking kids at 3 years old. And the reason for that was because in our community, it was what we know now is a first responder community or a working class community. And so a lot of the families there needed places for their children to be that were not of an age to go to kindergarten yet. And so there that programming was born, you know. And so it was a brilliant, again, another brilliant stroke of or idea from Arthur Mitchell.
Now, when the company tours, how many weeks out of a year do they tour? Do you have a approximate number of weeks? And do they tour? I know they tour the country as well as internationally.
Yes, yes. Our contracts for our dancers are about 36 weeks.
Okay.
About 15 or so weeks of that, maybe a little more performing. The rest are rehearsing in preparation for that.
Right.
That can, of course, throughout the year can balloon to other numbers, but basically that's how it works.
Okay.
So.
Okay. And tell me about dancing through barriers.
Yes.
Because I didn't know this existed till I started doing a little research about you and the Dance Theatre of Harlem. Dancing through barriers. Would you explain that?
Yeah. So Arthur Mitchell, when he first formed his company, as I already said, the community was like, there's no way this is going to work. And so what he did was he created a program where he would take his dancers out to public schools, to small theaters, and have them perform what we call now a lecture demonstration, which is an informal presentation on the making of a dancer.
Okay.
You know, and so you do a little bit of ballet, you show them some dances, a lot of time for kids, but it works for adults as well. And so that was something that he'd always done. And the Dancing Through Barriers moniker came when they were reopening the theater in Johannesburg after the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. And so the idea was they booked us. Dance Theatre of Harlem was supposed to come, and Arthur Mitchell told South Africa, no, we're not going to come if we don't go out to the townships. And you know, they have a township for everything in South Africa.
Right.
The mixed race township, the Chinese and black township, the Indian and white township. And so we went ahead of time and essentially danced through the barriers of those places and did masterclass series, which culminated in a performance in Johannesburg. One of the few times I've ever seen Arthur Mitchell so completely humbled was his meeting Nelson Mandela and just completely just being floored by him. Wow. Yeah.
But what a brilliant concept.
Yeah.
Using the arts to break down barriers.
Yes.
The commonality. And I often say we tell stories because it's about our shared humanity, regardless of race, creed, color. We have a shared humanity. And if you do that through stories or you do that through music, you do it through dance. I think that's a brilliant concept.
It's a brilliant concept that still works to this day. You know, I think that I'm seeing more and more that, you know, Dance Theatre of Harlem is about community, honestly.
Yes.
You know, I've been meditating on this, and I want to share this with my dancers. There's an African proverb from the Ubuntu people that says, I am because we are, and we are because I am. And I just love that phrase. But it's not lost on me that the shortest poem in the English language now, I don't know if it's conjecture or not, but from what I understand, is a poem that Muhammad Ali made, because a reporter said, "Hey, champ, you know, give us a poem, you know," and so he was like, "Me, we," and that was it.
Wow.
And it's the shortest poem in the English language, actually.
But-
Yes, exactly. So there's that, and then also Dumas, the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. You know, is another phrase in Dumas, for those that don't know, was French, but was actually African as well.
Absolutely.
African parentage, and all for one and one for all. So I'm been meditating a lot on these three ideas of how African culture has always been about community and all for one and one for all, me, we, I am because we are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's great. That's you've had now what you said. It's 55 years old.
55, that's right.
So as you look to the future, what are your concerns? What are your dreams? What you've got a lot on your plate. I, as I said when we sat down, I can't believe you're taking time from your busy schedule to do this because you are doing so much.
Yeah.
But what is the future, and how are you going to address the future of Dance Theatre of Harlem?
You know, one of the things that has been really good of late has been the DEI conversation, diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the challenges of late have been DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
All right.
Because I really think that in the conversation, they never reckoned with the history of why we needed this programming to begin with. They kind of started with intersectionality. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't help my 10-year-olds in, you know, in level 5
Right.
at Dance Theatre of Harlem, you know. So one of my hopes is that we begin to broaden the conversation and begin to grasp some of the history and some of it that's not so pleasant, but is necessary to understand how we all can move forward together. I believe that Dance Theatre of Harlem is still a standard bearer in that regard. And so that's my high philosophical hope.
Okay. Okay. And of course, like all art, unfortunately, as soon as the economy dips or there's budget cuts, it's usually the arts.
Precisely.
And
Exactly.
and I go, wow, that the thing that awakens our humanity and connects us and reminds us we are a community, that's the first thing to go.
That's the first thing to go.
And that's a shame.
It's a shame because it affects our children.
Right.
And that's another little bit of a gripe I have with the DEI space, is that they typically only want to talk about people that are at the high ends, that are already trained, but what about the ones that haven't, the children?
Right.
They're the ones, eventually, equity has a price tag, and we have to have that conversation.
Yes, yes. Okay, so a young child in Harlem or from Nebraska comes to you and says, Mr. Garland, how do I become a dancer? What do you say to them besides practice?
Well, I say, I imagine your life is a little larger than that. You would like to be an artist, and so what does that entail? I got, as we talked about, I was trained at Juilliard, which was a wonderful experience. But there was also a moment where I felt like I might be losing a little something. And so I looked and discovered James Baldwin. And so I found Baldwin and read his entire oeuvre for my 4 years at Juilliard. And that helped to shape me as much as my dance career did, because he gave me permission to be who I am, and no one had ever given me permission before. But I was like, this guy is like amazing. And so I tell them all, please, any intellectual, public intellectual that you feel akin to, Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson, my friend Imani Perry, pick them up, learn them, embrace them, because they can all only help. And that's help children of all colors, not just Black children.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is called Glimpses because the book is Glimpses, comedy writer's take on life, love, and all that spiritual stuff. But the glimpses are finding moments of God in the daily life. And by God, we're not talking about a deity necessarily, but goodness, grace, moment. I'm sure you see this quite often in your life. Do you see glimpses in your daily life?
Daily. Daily.
All right.
And leaving the space for the glimpses.
Ooh, that's good. Leaving the space for the glimpses.
Yes.
Okay.
You have to leave the space for the glimpses because, as Carol Shook, our co-founder of Dance Theatre of Harlem, who took care of the school side while Arthur Mitchell did the company side, he said prejudices are sophisticated things. Like they take an enormous amount of energy to become prejudice, So I think his idea was, if you spent the same amount of energy reversing that, we may come up with what Dr. King called our beloved society. Yes. Our beloved society. One of the things I tell my kids all the time, that, there were people during the civil rights movement that would approach Dr. King and say, Dr. King, your vision is so equalizing, and eventually someone's going to have to lead, and jumping way ahead,
Right.
And his response, if I'm correct, was I believe that everyone has a gift. Everyone has a purpose, every single one of us.
Yes.
And finding your purpose is what this is about, and coming together and everyone being a part of this community that I talked about earlier, the me, we,
Right.
and making a better world.
I think that's a
Honestly.
perfect way to wrap this up.
Okay.
Robert Garland, I'm thrilled that you were here. I do
you.
appreciate you taking the time. And
you.
I want to encourage all the listeners, as you go about your day, take the time to look around and catch a glimpse.
Catch a glimpse. Leave spaces for it.
Leave spaces for the glimpse.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My friends, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Glimpses. Speaking of, Glimpses is now available for purchase at your online retailer of choice. And the best part? Every penny earned will be going to charities who support children in need. You can get your copy in the link below. Until next time, have an amazing day.